What's up guys, my name is Troy, but I also go by TangelaBoots, and today I'm bringing you the Season 2 PEBA Post-Draft Power Rankings. For those of you that don't know, I actually did the Power Rankings for Season 1. It's a little bit crazy now, because it's been just over a year since that happened. It's like a year and a month since I uploaded that video. So man, time flies. It's really crazy looking back at that video, and I was talking about so many of the people in there, having not really known them for that long or talked to them for that long, but now I'm entering into this, and this league is filled with, a bunch of really talented people, a lot of my friends, a lot of people that I consider very important to me in the Pokemon community. So it's just really cool how far it's come as a league. Before I get into the part that everybody, is here for, which is the actual rankings, I have to give my obvious disclaimers and everything. First of all, I am by no means a great analyst. I like to focus on myself as a player rather than as evaluating other people's teams, because I think a team is what the player can make of it, and I'm not going to be talking as much about each player's skill as much as I'm going to be talking about their teams on paper. In addition, I just have to say before I go any further that I think all of these teams are good. Some people might call that generous or something, but in my opinion, none of these teams are bad. From what I can tell, a lot of our returning coaches have made improvements, at least on how they drafted last time. Even if their ranking has fallen overall, I think everybody has improved over this past year. I don't think anybody's walked backwards or hasn't really gone anywhere. I also want to add, please take these rankings with a grain of salt. I worked on them pretty hard. I have a whole, 4 pages of paper here with notes on them about every single person's team, but I'm not perfect. I've never been perfect at these power ranking things. Last time I had the Season 1 champion at number 9, I think, out of 16, so yeah. I'm definitely not perfect when it comes to making these, but I do hope to at least give some insight, maybe a second opinion, maybe some weaknesses, or maybe some parts that are good. I hope to give every team at least something that they may have not thought about already, or maybe need to fix, or maybe need to be mindful of. And I also hope that this gives people a chance to maybe see which teams are the most threatening, or which teams they need to be the most scared of, at least in my opinion, and hopefully you'll at least see where I'm coming from. With that being said, just to go over the structure of this league's draft just a little bit before I talk about everybody's teams. It is essentially a mixture of a point-based draft and a tier-based draft. There's essentially 5 Pokemon that you have to draft, 1 from each tier, and then a Mega, and then you spend points on the rest. In addition, there's also a separate set of points that you use to determine which Pokemon are your Z users. So, for example, if you got a Tier 1 Z user, you're not going to be able to afford any other Z users. Whereas if you get, some other mixture of tiers, you might be able to afford 2. So as I analyze people's teams, I am going to have to take into account the format of the draft, as well as the fact that, when I'm talking about Z users, some teams are going to have 1, some teams are going to have 2. And just because it's worth saying one more time, this is all my opinion. I can be wrong about this stuff. I don't want people yelling at me in the comments section or in the Discord server. That's basically what I'm trying to say. I am going to try and defend my opinions, but they are by no means fact, and that's pretty much all. So without further ado, let's actually jump into the power rankings. There's 18 coaches, so we're going to start at the bottom at number 18 and work our way up. Oh man, it never gets easier to talk about the person that gets put at the bottom. It is unfortunate. At the end of the day, somebody has to be at number 18 and somebody does have to be number 1. And what's really unfortunate about a league like this, where all the teams are at least kind of good, is that somebody has to be the least kind of good. In my opinion, that team for me, at least with this season, is Fosse Fox. Now with Fosse Fox, it's not his fault necessarily that his team isn't great. Part of the problem was that he actually took over this team mid-draft. Basically, we had a coach lined up. He was not around for reasons out of his control, so we had to get a quick replacement to take over for him in the middle of the draft, and he actually had to make some makeup picks. So that means that a lot of certain things were taken. He wasn't able to participate in the draft as actively as the other coaches, and that kind of led to his team, I guess, not being what it could have been, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now you may be thinking, this team has a lot of good Pokemon on it, and you'd be right by saying that. I think this team actually has a lot of really, really good Pokemon on it, but it's how they fit together that bothers me, and that's what put me at the bottom and gave it a D grade. That D is a D plus though, don't worry. I didn't have room on the layout to put pluses or minuses, but I'll be saying them. So I gave this team a D plus, and it is at the bottom. So now let's talk about why. If I had to describe this team in a couple of words, I would say it's like a strange Frankenstein's monster of playstyles. And what I mean by that is it's kind of just a bunch of different ideas cut up and thrown together. At least that's what it looks like. I don't want that to sound mean, but that's just what I'm seeing. If we just take a look at the type cores for a minute, let's see, the Fairy Dragon Steel, so that's Skarmory, and then you have the Mimikyu and the Kommo-o. That's actually a pretty good type core, but if you look closer in how they work together, it's kind of strange. Yes, Skarmory can set up the hazards for those two to sweep, but it's so weird because, like, they're very offensive Pokemon, and Skarmory is so defensive, and it just doesn't seem exactly to fit. Especially when you consider, like, in terms of hazard setter and remover, you also have Donphan, and you also have Torkoal. And then, like, it just continues to add up like that. Like, all of the team's little issues, you kind of start to see how it's like a bunch of weird puzzle pieces that don't exactly lock, but, like, you can make them lock if you want them to. The bulkier side of this team is particularly troubling to me. You have really bulky Pokemon like Lomomola and Cresselia, and while they're good Pokemon, I don't like how they work on this team. Especially considering the fact that neither of these Pokemon learns Heal Bell, which means that this team is actually extremely weak to Toxic. In fact, the only Toxic switch-in really is Skarmory, because there's no Poison type, which means that this team is incredibly Toxic Spikes weak. And yes, again, Skarmory can remove hazards, but Skarmory is relatively easy to prep for, at least in terms of coverage moves. And your other hazard removers are going to be spinners here, so they're going to have to take the Toxic Spikes. So much of this team is grounded as well, which is a big issue. Yes, Cresselia isn't grounded, but you can still Toxic it, and pretty much every Pokemon learns Toxic, like, let's be real. The Fire, Water, Grass core, I already mentioned how I feel about a Lomomola. I don't really like it on this draft. The Fire, Water, Grass core is there, but it's like a budget Fire, Water, Grass core. I don't really know how I feel about it. I don't know how I feel about Torkoal in particular, especially because, like I said, Donphan is there, Skarmory is there. They kind of already do their job as hazard management. I do understand the idea of having Torkoal to maybe Sun Boost the Houndoom, the Leafeon, and even the Heliolisk, but that kind of feels tacked on. It doesn't feel like that was part of the original plan of this team, if there even was a plan. And it just kind of feels like it's a little bit disappointing in terms of trying to capitalize on Torkoal as a Sunsetter. This team is not without threats, though. I don't want to give you guys the wrong idea. Mimikyu, Kommo-o, Terrakion, even Houndoom can all win games very easily, sometimes on their own, and they only need some team support to pull off their jobs. Especially with Z Terrakion. Terrakion as a Z user is probably one of the best things that Fosse Fox could do to kind of give his team extra boost, because that thing is so strong, and since it's one of his faster Pokemon, it's definitely going to allow him to put in some damage. Speaking of speed really quick, I do need to mention how this team's speed tiers really irk me as well. You do have some Pokemon that outspeed the base 100 range. You have Terrakion, you have Heliolisk, and you have Houndoom. My problem with this team is that not many Pokemon on here are willing to run Choice Scarf, and that means that even though he has these Pokemon that hit these speeds, none of them are really going to want to wear the Choice Scarf. Now, why is that, you may ask? First of all, none of the defensive Pokemon, you can already guarantee, are not really going to want to run Choice Scarf. You're not going to see Choice Scarf for Cresselia, at least I don't think so, unless it's going to be tricking it onto something. Mimikyu obviously doesn't want Choice Scarf because it's setting up, neither does Kommo-o, because Kommo-o normally sets up. It could run Scarf, I suppose. But in terms of these faster Pokemon, Heliolisk doesn't really like to run Scarf because it likes damage output. Terrakion is your Z user, and you're only one at that, so you lose the potential to run a Z move for the match. And then Houndoom obviously cannot run a Z Crystal because it is a Mega Pokemon. Everything else kind of lacks the speed to really make Scarf worth it, or the damage output in some way. Basically what I'm trying to get at is, I see this team getting outsped a lot. So anyways, Fosse Fox, I'm sorry. Somebody had to be at the bottom. Also, I hope I'm saying your name right, by the way. I've never had to say it out loud. I hope like I said, this team can win games. This team can put in work in the right circumstances. It's just the way the team fits together that I'm not a fan of. A good player can do well in spite of that, but you're basically putting yourself behind at the jump if your team doesn't fit nicely, if there's no synergy. And that's all I have to say really about this team. That's what led me to give it a D+ rating. And now we're going to move on to the next team. Alright, our next team up here is Galidite and the Northside Noivern. He also got a D+ rating from me. This team, while it does share a rating with the previous team, I do think has a couple small improvements, but also has its own set of problems. The first thing I noticed upon looking at this team was immediately all of the dual typings. Doubling up on typings is kind of a double-edged sword in most cases. Sometimes it can be very effective. For example, if you have two water types, so one is offensive and one is your typical bulky water, that's a case where having two water types makes a lot of sense because they're filling different niches that the other one doesn't. But sometimes double typings means that you miss out on certain things on your team, or it means that you lack certain coverage, or that you have overlapping weaknesses. And for this team, I see more of the latter than the former. I see more cases where dual typings hinder rather than help. For example, Suicune and Mantine. While I see the idea behind drafting Mantine since it is a defogger, both of them at the end of the day are bulky water types. While one is usually a win con and one is usually support, like they still are prepped for in almost the same way. If you have a strong electric type, you can prepare for it with just bringing that for both of those Pokemon, and your job is simplified. Palossand and Krookodile, for example. I don't really see what one brings to the table over the other. Obviously, I would prefer Krookodile, but what does Palossand do that Krookodile doesn't, besides, like, recover, I guess? They both set up rocks, they're both ground types. They both kind of have a weird secondary typing on top of ground. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's something I'm missing there? I'm not sure. And I wish I could say that's the end of it, but there's actually more. You also have Venusaur and Kartana, and that one's a little bit better because at least you have one that's bulky and one that's offensive. But because of the previous examples that I mentioned, it just makes me feel like there was a lack of planning or preparation into considering that, and it wasn't a intentional choice, but rather kind of just, I liked these Pokemon, so I drafted them, and they just so happen to share weaknesses. Doublade is probably the biggest offender to me on this team because you already have Kartana as your Steel type, and you already have Palossand now as a Ghost type, so I don't know what Doublade's really doing here. I can appreciate the fact that it's going to be, you know, able to pressure things with priority, but again, just the fact that you managed to double up on typings twice with one pick is a little bit troubling to me. Now obviously, doubling up on typings doesn't mean everything. I just kind of want to make an example out of this team as to, you know, why that might not work all the time and the problems that kind of come with that. This team can still do well. It's just kind of something that I think people are going to notice and take advantage of when they're preparing for this team. Another big issue I see with this team is that there's no dragon. If we're talking about type cores, lacking a dragon type here really hurts this team, I have to say. Fire, Water, Grass is pretty good though, since you have two water options and two grass options, like I already mentioned, and then also Pyroar. I feel like that's decent enough. You know, you kind of check off that box right there. This team does have two Z users, and while they're both kind of underrated, I think they get the job done. You have one physical and one special. They don't have terrible speeds, and they do have some decent coverage moves, although I will say I think Thunderous Eye or Kartana, even though it's only one Z user, I think probably would have been better in the long run. They're just really good Pokemon, and I think you're going to be relying on them anyways, so I would have preferred to see maybe one of them get the Z Crystal instead, but that's just my opinion. And while I mentioned a lot of the things on here that kind of make the team have a bunch of overlapping weaknesses, there are cases on this team where there's a lot of synergy. Mega's Venusaur and Krookodile, for example, work really well with each other in terms of covering each other's weaknesses and the way they work together. Krookodile is a great Pokemon, and the fact that it can set up Stealth Rocks and chip things down. Venusaur can put things to sleep so that Krookodile can try and get a Moxie boost better, you know what I mean? Like, type-wise they fit well together, and playstyle-wise they fit well together. Overall for me, this team kind of comes down to the fact that it's kind of top-heavy, and what I mean by that is it's kind of carried by the higher tier Pokemon on this team, I see Thunderous Eye, Kartana, Crocodile, and Mega Venusaur coming to almost every single game. I mean, I'm not exactly sure if that's how it will work out, and obviously matchups can vary and change how your plan goes, but on paper, all the top tier Pokemon are threatening, where on some of these other drafts, especially when I get towards the top of the list, every Pokemon is a threat. And that's just not something that I feel like I can say about this team necessarily. Again, not that this team is without threats on it at all. It definitely has threats. It just isn't as threatening as the other teams, and it has a lot of things that just kind of throw me off about it. So that is why it's down here at number 17, and I gave it a D+. Alright, next up at number 16, we have Toasty Rex and the Madison Mudkips. I gave this team a grade of C-. It's a bit of an unconventional team, but Toasty Rex has kind of proved himself to be an unconventional player, in a sense. He's very creative when it comes to team building, at least that's from my experience. There are a lot of Pokemon on here that don't really get their chance in the limelight as often. I'm going to say specifically Mega Garchomp, that gets slept on a lot. And I'm also going to go out there and support Espeon completely, because I love Espeon. And of course I have to mention Tangela. He drafted Tangela for 2 seasons in a row, so shouts out to him. This is how you know I'm not being biased, by the way, because if I really, really wanted to be biased, I would just put this team at number 1 because he drafted Tangela. It's as simple as that. This team has really good Pokemon, and I still feel weird about putting this team as low as it is, but I do have my reasons. Webs feels like it's very important to this team's success with some of the slower threats on here, like Azumarill and Garchomp and Emboar. This team also has a lot of blistering speed with Galvantula, Crobat, Espeon, even Cobalion passing that 100 threshold. But the good speed tiers that this team has kind of gets diminished by the fact that these faster Pokemon are a little bit on the weaker side in terms of offense. Webs, like I said though, do help this team a lot, and if he is able to manage hazards very well and keep webs up and get them up consistently in all of his games, he can afford to run like Adamant or Modest Crobat or Adamant or Modest Cobalion. There are a lot of Pokemon here that don't require speed to do well, such as Azumarill. And Azumarill can potentially go for Liquidations instead of Aqua Jets. It's all a matter of how you play around it. The Fire Water Grass core is present, it's bulky, but it's insanely slow. Again, I see those webs there, they're going to help, but you can't count on webs all the time. I will give points to the Fairy Dragon Steel because I'm a big fan of it. I like Azumarill, Cobalion, and Garchomp together, Mega Garchomp that is. I think I would actually go as far to say it would be a pretty perfect Fairy Dragon Steel core if it was normal Garchomp as opposed to Mega Garchomp. Losing out on that speed just really kind of messes Mega Garchomp up. But I will say that it's an underrated Mega overall, and I think a lot of people do sleep on it just because it loses those 10 points in speed. I think this team has a little bit of an identity crisis. Parts of it are very bulky and stally, while other parts kind of want to do big damage, and it's a weird kind of mishmash. Again though, Toasty Rex is a very creative builder and battler, but that comes down to more about his skill level as opposed to his team on paper. And from what I see on paper, I could see this team kind of struggling in terms of the roles that these Pokemon are going to get fit in. The 2 Z users are pretty slow. That's another issue that I have with this team. I can appreciate Diancie being a Z user, especially with Z Heal Bell being pretty good, but I don't know what else it could really run. I mean, I know it's not super bad in its normal form as opposed to its mega form, but I do think it kind of lacks damage output to make use of anything else as a Z move. That's just me. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't have the calcs open, you know, I'm not preparing for anybody in this because I'm not playing, so that's just my observation. I do think it would have been nice though to at least make one of the Z users faster, like maybe Cobalion as a Z user. That's just my opinion, but I think Cobalion really could have used the Z Crystal to kind of push its damage output over the edge and kind of fix that problem that's here where these faster Pokemon can't do immediate damage with their speed. You have to remember, Cobalion's attack is only like base 90, I think. The only other criticism that I'm going to mention here is the fact that this team really doesn't appreciate setup. It lacks ways to deal with it, and a lot of these Pokemon can potentially be setup fodder. Diancie, Tangela, and Crobat, for example, all can potentially struggle on stopping setup Pokemon, and in turn can't pressure them enough in order to prevent a sweep. Especially when priority comes into the mix, a lot of these fast but fragile Pokemon really kind of crumble. I'm thinking about your Mach Punchers, your Bullet Punchers, and your Aqua Jetters. Overall, I guess I can't grill this team for too much. It just lacks a clear playstyle to me. It's a little too dependent on the webs. The Pokemon on here are either really fast or really slow. They either really want the webs or couldn't care less. And the different playstyles that this team represents are literally night and day. You have Umbreon and you have Espeon. I mean, they're pretty different in terms of the roles they kind of fulfill. I mean, I guess they're both a little bit support in a way, but just stat distribution wise. We're talking about a very defensive Pokemon, and we're talking about a very fast, fragile Pokemon. So overall, while this team is a step up from the previous two, I did have to put it down here at number 16. Next up at number 15, we have Eevee Master and the Brooklyn Banettes, and he also has a grade of C-. Now Eevee Master, for some reason, and I'm not going to take personal offense to this, but he managed to draft a lot of the same Pokemon he drafted in Season 1. And the reason that is significant is because I rated his team last place in Season 1. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, he came last in Season 1, and he's clearly not last for this season, but he drafted a lot of the same Pokemon, so what's the deal? The fact of the matter is, Eevee is still kind of a slave to the same couple of Pokemon, and he drafted what is comfortable, but he did manage to address some of the criticisms I had about his team last season, and I think he has a little bit of a better team this season. Medicham, Excadrill, Amoonguss, Gigalith, Lantern, and I think maybe even Chandelure were all on the team last season. I wrote down here some of my criticisms of Eevee's Season 1 team, so I'm going to mention them so we can at least address how he kind of turned his team around a little bit from last season. I criticized Eevee for repeating types, not using sand enough, and overall a slow speed. Starting off with the speed tiers, Eevee did make strides to improve. There are some slow Pokemon on here like Gigalith, like Lantern, and like Amoonguss, but there's also a lot of fast Pokemon that he's added. Bombi is very fast, Sneasel is really fast and also has that priority, and Salamence hits that base 100, which I mean is saying a lot considering Eevee's last team. Of course, we also have Excadrill and Stoutland in the sand. Last season he only had Excadrill in the sand, and now he has Stoutland as well, so he has 2 sand rushers. That's another thing I criticized Eevee's team about, was the fact that he didn't capitalize on his sand setter enough. It felt like Gigalith was just there to set up for Excadrill. While I do still kind of feel like that's the case, at least there is Stoutland now as well, so if he wants to go with the sand option, he has more than just Excadrill to hold on to hope with. Overall, looking at this team, and it's what I said about his team last season too, the sand element does still feel really tacked on, however. It feels like this team could have gone a different direction if Excadrill just kind of left the sand at home. It works on its own as a steel type pretty well. I do understand the idea of having Gigalith there to support it with the sand, but I know how Eevee Master kind of works, and he loves to use Excadrill, and sometimes you just can't rely on Sand Rush Excadrill to fix all your problems. Let's talk about some good things Eevee Master did though. Z Salamence is great. It's probably one of the best things about this team. It's by far his best Z candidate, and I'm glad that he picked it. Ribombee is wonderful. The fact that it can set up sticky webs really supports his team, especially Mega Medicham, who can't boost its speed otherwise, unlike all these sand rushers. And Mega Medicham is such a threat. He also had Mega Medicham last season, and now that he has webs on his team, I do think that it will be able to help. Medicham can put in work on its own without webs, but it's a supporting element that I think can help his team a lot. The Fairy Dragon Steel core here is really good. The Salamence, the Excadrill, and the Ribombee, I think that's a really good core. The Fire Water Grass core leaves a little bit to be desired. The Chandelure, the Amoonguss, and the Lantern. I do like these Pokemon, it's just kind of, I don't know. I feel like there's something missing there. I feel like Lantern gets chipped down a little bit too easily. Chandelure likes a lot of protection from hazards, and Amoonguss kind of just would prefer to be among other Regenerator Pokemon, I feel, and, you know, they all kind of look like different Pokemon from different cores. They aren't terrible together, it's just they're not great together. I do have to give some respect points for drafting his own mascot in Eevee, but To be completely honest, I do think he could have used something else in that last slot. That's just me. I do think there are certain weaknesses on his team that he could have drafted more resistances to, such as Ice, for example. His Steel type, normally the type that you want to resist Ice, does not resist Ice, it's Excadrill. His Dragon is 4 times weak to Ice. Lantern can serve as a switch-in, but it doesn't have reliable recovery, so that's part of the issue. Another type I see this team having issues with is Ground. Salamence is the only immunity, and in terms of resistances, Ribombee. Ribombee is pretty much the only one. Amoonguss, which is your grass type, something you want to resist Ground, does not. But again, there are glimpses of synergy here. Like I already mentioned, Ribombee setting up webs for Medicham. Obviously, Gigalith works as a really reliable self-rock setter to help Z Salamence do its job. Those rocks will chip away to allow a sweep to happen much easier. I'm a fan of Chandelure, actually, when it fits with the other Pokemon on this team, not necessarily in the Fire, Water, Grass core. I like that it can be a fighting immunity for both Excadrill and Gigalith and Stoutland, all of them being weak to fighting and all of them belonging to the same kind of sand mode of the team. The fact that Chandelure can be there to be an immunity for that type is pretty crucial. So yeah, Eevee, even though you didn't take my advice really and drafted the same team, I can at least acknowledge that you made some strides to make some improvements. Just be careful, because people have already seen you use these Pokemon before. You're going to need to be creative, you know, maybe try and pull out some tricks or something. In the end though, yeah, I have you here at number 15, C-. At least you're not one of those D+ teams, just think of it that way. And yeah. Alright, next up at number 14 we have Young Bisharp. Young Bisharp also gets a C-, and man oh man, I'm gonna get a lot of comments about this team. So initially, I actually wanted to put this team a lot higher. I'll be completely honest with you. And I talked to some people, some unbiased people that are not related to this league whatsoever, and they kind of talked me down from it. I was mainly going to put this team up so high because of how excited I was about its concept, because you basically have a sand and hail team here, which is something I've never seen before. I've never seen anybody attempt to try and do. And here Young Bisharp has probably the best possible version of a sand hail team that you could potentially draft. In my opinion, you can't really do much better with such a weird, strange archetype as sand and snow. They're such weird weathers on their own, and together, they're even weirder. But in my mind, I just couldn't stop thinking about how good some of these Pokemon are. Charizard X is a huge threat on any team, and it can kind of exist outside of the two weathers. Tyranitar, Mamoswine, Landorus Eye, Magnezone, Alolan Ninetales, and even Starmie are all incredible Pokemon. And the fact that he has both Sand Slashes means that he can abuse either weather with either Sand Rush or Slush Rush Pokemon. The Fire, Water, Grass is here, Charizard X, Gourgeist, and Starmie. It's not a perfect core, but it gets the job done. There's also a Fairy Dragon Steel here with Ninetales, Magnezone, and Charizard X. You could also slide in Alolan Sand Slash for the Steel type, it doesn't really matter. And that core I actually think is even better. Those are all really solid Pokemon. Alolan Ninetales, Magnezone, and Charizard X are all really strong and good attackers. And that kind of fits Young Bisharp's playstyle from what I've seen. He seems to prefer hyper offense. At the end of the day though, this is a sand and snow team. Basically what I had to come to terms with is the fact that sand and snow teams are really cool, but there's so many better things you could do. And that's just kind of how I had to grade this team. I'm really impressed, and I'm going to be very excited to watch all of Young Bisharp's games because of this team, but I had to be realistic and I had to be fair, and this team has problems. It has so many common type weaknesses. Fighting is a huge issue. Yes, there's Gourgeist and Xatu and Starmie and I guess Landorus, but overall, I mean, there's Tyranitar, there's Mamoswine, there's Alolan Sandslash, and there's Magnezone, and those are all pretty important Pokemon to the team, and so none of them want to take the fighting type damage. This team, just because of the nature of it, will struggle with water. The rock and ground types are obviously going to be weak, and then the ice type side of things aren't going to be able to hit with their stab. Magnezone remedies the issue because it can remove steel types, which are also a problem type for this team. Tyranitar and Alola Ninetales don't really appreciate it. Magnezone is a step in the right direction for handling the water types. It can basically come in and deal big damage to bulky water types that would normally trouble this team a lot, and so its presence there is at least helpful in combating that. This team doesn't exactly like dealing with hazards either. While it could have focused a lot on ice and had a ton of Stealth Rock weaknesses, it focused more on the sand side. To be fair, there could have been a lot more ice types and therefore a lot more Stealth Rock weaknesses, but this team still really doesn't appreciate Stealth Rocks at all. Charizard X, if on Mega Evolve, to lose 50% on switch in, you don't want that, especially if you're playing Hyper Offense and you might not have Roost. Alola Ninetales takes 25% every single time it comes in, so does Xatu. Xatu does help, at least with Magic Bounce, but I mean, Xatu can't come to every game, that's just realistic. Magnezone potentially loses its Sturdy, which is a pretty useful ability to have sometimes. I know Analytic is great, but sometimes the utility of Sturdy is very important. And yeah, the team just kind of gets chipped down. And, you know, that is kind of the case with a lot of hyper offense teams, but it just seems a little more important for this team to avoid that kind of damage. And it doesn't really do a ton to prevent rocks from getting up, and it's a little bit harder for it to remove rocks once they're already up. Like, yes, there are removers like Starmie and Landorus, but they're fragile, and they don't want to take the time in the middle of a hyper offense battle to remove hazards, necessarily. I do, though, want to address young Bisharp personally and say I am a fan of this team. I think Tyranitar, Mamoswine, and Landorus Eye, and Magnezone, they all kick ass. I want to see both the Sandslashes do really well. It's just factually, on a technical level, a Sand-Snow team doesn't work practically. When you look at a Sand-Snow team, it doesn't work necessarily in practice how it will on paper. And how I like how this team looks on paper, and I think it's really unique and innovative, I think it's going to struggle in the end because its gimmicks are predictable. You know, it's easy to counter this team with bringing rain or sun. Even if your team isn't built around those weathers, you can just slap it onto a Pokemon and then it nullifies some of the important boosts that this team is playing around. This team does have a lot of big threats though, outside of the weather. Tyranitar is still going to be doing a lot of damage at +1 after a Dragon Dance. Mamoswine's still going to be hitting hard with like Choice Band Ice Shards. Landorus Eye is still going to be able to Calm Mind and then use a Z move and obliterate the competition. But at the end of the day, the synergy that this team shares around the two most unreliable weathers in the game, it just isn't enough. Essentially, you've built a really great team on a unsturdy foundation. That foundation being hail and sand. So overall, I'm sorry, young Bisharp. I do like the team, but I had to place it down here at number 14 and give it a C- rating. Alright, next up is Drslacking. He falls at 13th place, and he just has a solid C rating. We're out of the C- range. Drslacking's team is a bit hard for me to talk about because I can't exactly place my finger on why I have it at the place it's at. This team has threats, and this team has good Pokemon on it. I just can't seem to find a reason to put it over the other teams. It's not that this team has a ton of problems and has a lot of specific criticisms like the previous teams. It's just that it doesn't have a ton in favor of it. Essentially, the way I feel about this team is, as a whole, it doesn't really stand out to me. But I do want to talk about some of the Pokemon on here because some of them are really fantastic. Infernape and Nidoking are, in my opinion, some of the best Pokemon in this format because of their versatility, because of the fact that they can run physical or special move pools, and sometimes concurrently. Sometimes it can run mixed sets, and I think that's something that's always valuable in a Pokemon in Draft League, to be able to hit things on all sides of the spectrum. Metagross, in my opinion, is an underrated Pokemon. Obviously, people would prefer to be using its Mega Evolved cousin, but more often than not, however, Mega Metagross is not allowed. So, normal Metagross is really good. I'm a huge fan of Miltank. If you know me and you've even seen some of my videos, you probably know that. I love this thing. and I think it's great at what it does. It's a fast but bulky support Pokemon that fills basically kind of any support role you want it to. It recovers, it has Heal Bell, it can set up rocks, it can do damage with Seismic Toss, basically does everything. There are type cores here. We have Infernape, Celebi, and Jellicent, which I actually think is a pretty great core. Those three together, it's pretty decent. And the Fairy Dragon Steel core. Altaria kind of fills in as both a fairy and a dragon here, but it makes up for it by the fact that there's two different steel types here, Durant and Metagross, which I really like because you have Metagross as a slow steel type and Durant as the fast one. Sometimes you can't rely on Metagross's bullet punch to get the job done, and so sometimes Durant will be able to step up to the plate and do its job. One of the specific things I can say about this team is that I wish it had a better electric type. There's nothing necessarily wrong with Luxray, it's just kind of the speed. This team is fortunate enough in that it doesn't have terrible speed tiers. Infernape and Durant are the two fast Pokemon here, but nothing else is really inherently slow. Nidoking, Miltank, even kind of Altaria and Porygon Z and Celebi all kind of hit this 100 and below range, which is, decent. It's not slow, but it's definitely not fast. Unfortunately, they have the added benefit of being really good Scarf users. Scarf Nidoking is very common. Altaria can Dragon Dance, and Porygon Z can use Agility, just as an example. Another thing I think I could say about this team is that it could have used more hazards, or at least different kinds. There's definitely a plethora of Stealth Rock setters here. You have Celebi, Nidoking, Infernape, I think Metagross too, and also Miltank, like I already mentioned. But I'd like to see maybe some type of Spike setter or Toxic Spike setter that this team doesn't have. I will, though, give this team credit for versatility. Like I already mentioned with Infernape and Nidoking, very versatile move pools, but I also should mention Celebi gets a very wide move pool that you wouldn't really think about, specifically with support moves. Porygon Z as a Z user actually gets a lot of good coverage moves as well, and I think that actually makes it a pretty underrated Z user pick. A lot of people are really sad that they can't use Z conversion, but I think it still works here. And the fact that he's able to get two Z users and also have Z Durant, I think is really great. Sometimes you can't afford that hustle hit to miss, and so you can guarantee it with Durant. Not to mention he also manages to have one physical and one special Z user, something that I always think is good and something you don't want to overlook, because you don't want to stack your Z users on one side over the other. And unfortunately, that's all I really have to say about Drslacking's team. I'm sorry I couldn't give more specific points about this team. It's just kind of hard for me, I guess. I really don't know why. To address Drslacking directly, I would definitely give this team a try. I wouldn't jump immediately to try and change things around just because I'm saying I don't really know whether this team is good or not, because I'm really just unsure about a lot of things here. This team on paper has a lot of versatility and has a lot of good Pokemon on it. It's just something about it doesn't exactly click, at least in my mind. Maybe it's the lack of a better electric type, maybe it's the lack of more clearly defined hazard setters. I think more obvious synergy is probably where most of my unsureness about this team lies. Like, this team is full of good Pokemon, I just can't exactly see where in planning they specifically line up with each other. I don't know if that makes any sense. I don't even know if I agree with myself on that. Those are just my thoughts on this team at the time of this video. So anyways, Drslacking, I wish you luck. I'm sorry that I didn't have a whole lot more to say about this team. I do think that it has some really good Pokemon on it. I do think that your Z users are underrated, and I think they will surprise some people. And Infernape, Nidoking, Altaria, Mega Altaria that is, you can't really go wrong with those three. I think those are three great Pokemon, and and I would say those three are probably like the biggest highlights of this team. Alright, next up, at number 12, we have Isaac and the Evergrande Empoleons, and his team also got a C rating, along with Drslacking. Isaac's team is very bulky. That's the first thing I noticed about it. You have Tapu Bulu, you have Nidoqueen, you have Mega Aggron, you have Vaporeon, you have Kinkeldurr, and even Latios over Latios. Latios does have some offensive potential, but it's the bulkier cousin of Latios. And to me that's a little bit strange considering Isaac is currently playing under a very fast, hyper-offensive team in my league named PCBL, so it's really kind of strange to me, but I am aware that Isaac can play multiple playstyles. It's just weird for me to see him playing these two very different teams concurrently. I like the Fire Water Grass core. It gets the job done. There's 2 grasses and there's 2 waters. Tapu Bulu, Rotom-Mow, and then Vaporeon, Sharpedo, and then finally Rapidash as the fire type. And while I like the Fire Water Grass core, I love the Fairy Dragon Steel core. I think Tapu Bulu, Latias, and Aggron is amazing, and just the compatibility of Tapu Bulu and Aggron alone, the fact that you can weaken opposing Earthquakes and support Aggron with reliable, basically leftovers, is a great idea. And Mega Aggron, in my mind, is consistently underrated. There are these duplicate typings that I've been complaining about, but this is a case where I think Isaac actually does it right. Specifically with Vaporeon and Sharpedo. Vaporeon serves, obviously, as what we all know it to be, a bulky Wish Passer, and it does that job very well, and you don't really need to step outside of that comfort zone that Vaporeon has. Sharpedo, however, gives him a water option that isn't confined to that. He has a water type that is offensive. You can sweep teams with Speed Boost. Even though this isn't Mega Sharpedo, it still has high damage output with a Life Orb or an Expert Belt, and it can be the water type that you wish you had instead of Vaporeon in cases where an offensive water type would be better. Rotom-Mow, though, I'm not a fan. In fact, Rotom-Mow and Yanmega are the 2 picks on here I really don't like. Rotom-Mow doesn't benefit from the grassy terrain that Tapu Bulu sets up because it's off the ground. The grass typing doesn't really do anything for Rotom-Mow that it doesn't already do for Tapu Bulu. Essentially, and this is just my theory, but what I can see happened is that Isaac needed another defogger, and he also needed an electric type. And from what I can tell, he decided to go for Rotom-Mow to fill both of those things at once. It's just it also came along with an extra grass type that he didn't really need, and it kind of doesn't really help him. And Yanmega, while I am a fan of it normally, just doesn't really seem to be a right fit for this team. Because there's essentially only 2 defoggers on here, and nothing else really removes things, it really appreciates to have rocks gone, and this team might not be able to remove them as immediately as Yanmega might need. I see Yanmega being a very occasional bring. So I could see this team using perhaps an extra hazard remover. That's one thing. And this team definitely does lack speed because of the bulk trade-off. Vaporeon, Nidoqueen, Aggron, even Tapu Bulu and Conkeldurr, obviously, are all pretty slow. This team's faster Pokemon fall on the hands of Frostlass and Latias, and they are above 100, don't get me wrong, but you don't want those 2 to be the only things that are kind of hitting that threshold, at least in my opinion. It's kind of like how I was saying about Toasty Rex. They're fast Pokemon, but they don't really hit hard immediately. You know, Frostlass isn't known for offensive prowess, and Latias does have the potential to put in high damage, but generally you want to have a Calm Mind first, or some other type of damage boosting item or set. This is also another team that really doesn't like opposing setup, and there's not a ton of ways for it to stop it. There is Roar Vaporeon, but outside of that, if the right Pokemon sets up against this team, it's kind of a recipe for disaster because there's not a lot of ways to stop it. This team can try and outbulk certain hits, but only to an extent, and a lot of these Pokemon will get worn down. Grassy terrain isn't going to solve all of the problems. I will praise Z Latias, and I also will give Latias credit for running Healing Wish. I also have to shout out Conkeldurr, that's another underrated Pokemon, and even Rapidash, which I've seen Isaac use well before. Overall, it's a pretty decent team, I gotta say. It definitely has its moments, like I said. I really am a fan of the Nidoqueen, the Latias, the Tapu Bulu, and that Aggron, especially Tapu Bulu and Aggron. I think that's really nice. And the fact that there's Nidoqueen, and it can go for ground moves in its grassy terrain. It's not bothered by the fact that, you know, there is grassy terrain about because it uses earth power. So I think that's really nice. And you know, he does have a lot of variety in the different hazards he can set up. He has rock options, he has toxic spikes with Nidoqueen, and he has normal spikes with Frostlass. And he even has a spin blocker in Frostlass too. That's another good point. If he does keep Yanmega, I would like to see him maybe pick up like a Rapid Spinner or something at some point along the way. But other than that, this is a pretty decent team. We're moving to the range of teams where like they start to get pretty good. So yeah, that's all I have to say about Isaac's team, and now we're going to move on to number 11. So here at number 11 we have Oscar and the Sea Folks Suicune, and I also gave him a C grade. If I could have rated Isaac's and Oscar's team as the same thing, I would have. And if you look at their team side by side, which I can't really do here in the video, you would see why. They are remarkably similar in construction. They both have a Mega Steel type that is bulky with Mega Aggron on Isaacs and Steelix over here. They both have a Tier 1 Dragon type that's off the ground as their Z user. They both decided to double up on water types, one defensive, here we have Slowbro, and one offensive, which is Araquanid. They both have excellent Fairy Dragon Steel cores. I'm a big fan of Dragonite, Sylveon, and Steelix. And they both have a little bit of a speed problem. Again, there are fast Pokemon on here, like Swellow, but everything else kind of falls a little bit below a decent speed level. And some of the Pokemon here are actually really slow, like Mega Steelix, Araquanid, Slowbro, and Sylveon. Even Hitmontop too. I will say webs help out a good amount on Oscar's team, where I think Isaac's team actually could have used it looking back. Isaac's response to his speed problem was, let me draft 2 speed boosters, while Oscar's approach is, let me try and get sticky webs up. I do think Oscar loses points though on the fact that he has Hitmontop as his remover, or his Rapid Spinner rather. Yeah, Rotom Freeze and Swellow, they get, defog, but it doesn't really, they don't really feel like hazard removers, and that's not really what I see them doing either. This team does have a good balance of offense and defense, like the previous teams have not. They fit together in a way that makes sense. Slowbro, for example, is a very defensive Pokemon, but it has a wide range of an offensive move pool, which means that it can sometimes add an extra coverage move to kind of fit on a team that's more based on offense, and it can be a bulky pivot. Steelix is another Pokemon that works great defensively, but can set up with Curse on a more offensive team. Sylveon is a Pokemon that can, run a bulky, bold, defensive wish set, or just go balls to the wall with choice specs. I will say a nitpick that I have with Oscar's team specifically is that it lacks rock resists. I mean, they're there, but not like how they should be. Steelix and Lucario resist rock ×4, which is very important, but they're also both steel type, which means both of them are going to be hit by the same super effective coverage. Hitmontop is another rock resist, and it's a different type, which it gets bonus points for, and it has Intimidate, but beyond that, there's a lot of rock weakness here. You have Rotom Freeze, Araquanid, Dragonite, Swellow, and Typhlosion, and a lot of these Pokemon don't appreciate rocks digging into them either, especially if they're running more offensive sets, like Spec Sylveon. Sylveon doesn't even want to have to deal with rocks when it's switching in to try and pass wishes either, even if it's running like a defensive set. Slowbro at least gets Regenerator, but it is going to get chipped down every single time it comes back in. And Zoroark is frail anyways. I mean, any added damage on Zoroark just puts it closer to death. So in my mind, I could see Oscar's team move in a better direction by either potentially making a trade to either remove a rock weakness or add another good rock resist. That's just my opinion. I will give some props to, like I said again, Fairy Dragon Steel Core. I'm a big fan of it. I do like Lucario. I haven't really mentioned it, but it works nicely as a faster, more immediate offense steel type as opposed to Steelix. It can put on a lot of pressure, and the fact that it can set up gives his team a really nice win condition with either Nasty Plot or Swords Dance and Bullet Punch or Vacuum Wave. Lucario is kind of an underrated Pokemon in that sense, and it can put in a lot of damage under the right circumstances. And I mean, Swellow is a big threat too. Dragonite with extreme speed. This team actually has a lot of priority, even though it might not seem like it at first. Dragonite, Swellow, Lucario, and even Hitmontop with Mach Punch and Sucker Punch and such. So yeah, I only put Oscar's team just slightly over Isaac's for the point of this ranking video, because I like how the webs fit in. I think relying on webs for Oscar's team specifically is a better approach than Isaac trying to kind of add these 2 speed boosters. But really though, these teams are very comparable, and the fact that they're friends kind of, makes me wonder if they kind of had the same ideas together, or if this is just some weird coincidence. It's a pretty good team, I gotta say, and I'm interested to see what Oscar can do with some of these Pokemon, namely Dragonite, who I haven't seen in draft play in a long time, and like I said, Lucario, which I think is very underrated, and also a Pokemon, now that I think of it, that I haven't seen used in draft leagues in a long time. Here at number 10, we have Todd and the Washington Blizzards, and this is our Season 1 champion of the PEBA. I did give him a grade of C+, as opposed to C, and on a completely unrelated note, this is going to be the last one that I record, because I'm starting to lose my voice. I don't know if you guys can tell. If it is noticeable, it will be fixed in the next set of teams, because I will be recording it on a different day. This is the last one I'm going to record for the day. So in making this video, I went back to my Season 1 Power Rankings video to do research in terms of writing the notes and coming up with the analysis. And I noticed a lot of the problems that I listed about Todd's team in that video kind of apply here. The main thing is that I feel like this team lacks glue. And what I mean by glue is that it lacks members of the team that kind of bring the Pokemon together and make them work in a way that provides synergy and balance. Rotom Wash, for example, is something that could be glue, theoretically, on this team, in the fact that it provides enough offensive pressure to fit with the offensive theme of this team, but it can't take all of the hits that this team requires alone. And yeah, there are other Pokemon on here that can take hits in certain situations, but I feel like this team could have preferred to have a little bit more of structure and backbone. Because this team doesn't read exactly like a hyper-offensive team, in a sense where on a hyper-offense team, you just, kind of throw out attacks until one of your Pokemon dies, or you need to sack something, and you throw out more attacks. You don't really need a defensive backbone, necessarily, on a hyper-offensive team. But this team doesn't exactly read like hyper-offense. Yes, there's some really strong Pokemon on here. Kyurem B with a Z move, hello? That's crazy. Crazy damage. Mega Gallade, insane wall breaker. And don't get me started on what Specs Keldeo can do, because that thing is a monster, let me tell you. So yeah, lacking a defensive backbone, I think kind of a problem for this team. Repeating types is another thing where this is an example where I think Todd's team doesn't exactly do it that great. You guys know how I feel about Bisharp, and Bisharp ended up being instrumental in his playoff run and eventually his championship win. But I don't really like Bisharp a ton still. I recognize Todd's ability to do well with it, but I just don't think it's the best Pokemon in draft format. However, that doesn't mean that he can't do well with it again. He's already proven that he can do well with it, but I don't like it on the same team as Klefki. I kind of wish he went with one or the other. It would have left him more room for different picks. Neither is bulky enough to take a ton of hits. What I will say though is that they work in tandem in a really weird way. I will give that combo credit for one reason. Klefki can Spike Stack, which will pressure the opponent to defog, which gives Bisharp a Defiant boost. That's a very niche and specific way that those two work together, but that's really it. I don't really see how they work well together other than that. In terms of cores, they're okay. You have Talonflame, Sceptile, and Keldeo or Rotom Wash, depending, and it's a really fast offensive core, and I don't know. I mean, I'm a fan of Sceptile, I'm a fan of Talonflame, and I'm a fan of Keldeo, but it just kind of seems weird those three together, specifically. I feel like there should be more picks on here that kind of support the meat of this team, and when I say the meat, I kind of mean like the big, hard, heavy hitters, and to me, that's Kyurem B and Gallade. Sceptile and Talonflame kind of feel more like just being tacked on because they're a grass and a fire type, and this team was lacking a grass and a fire type. Not because they actually do anything specific, just that they might be able to do something because they're a type that he doesn't have. I always talk about cores in these kinds of videos like there's something that's very important and there's something that every team needs. And there's a bit of truth to that. Cores are a tried and true method of team building. But you shouldn't just add Pokemon to create a type core just because that's what you're supposed to do. And in my mind, I feel like Todd could have maybe used that advice. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is what Todd planned. Maybe this is what he wanted. But it feels to me like Sceptile doesn't offer a lot to the table for this team. This team already has speed. It already has offense. You know what I mean? It doesn't need Sceptile, nor does it really need Talonflame to just kind of take 50% on a Stealth Rock switch in. or 49, I guess, if you're doing EVs. Overall, I need to give this team prop because of the really strong offensive Pokemon on here. But essentially, this team will come down to playing a blow-for-blow play style in terms of, like, it will do big damage, but then take big damage. And that's kind of, you know, something you want to have more of a hyper-offensive draft for, but a lot of Pokemon on here don't fit that bill. Gliscor, Dusknoir, Rotom Wash, and Klefki don't really fit here, or a Selgor. I know Klefki and a Selgor are doing the team a service by spike stacking, but at the end of the day, they're kind of just sitting ducks against opposing offensive teams. Not to mention, a Selgor isn't really doing anything extra that Klefki isn't doing already. Maybe, I guess, using Final Gambit, that's something. So yeah, that's how I feel about Todd's team. But who knows, he could just, you know, win Season 2 on top of Season 1 and prove me wrong yet again. Alright guys, so we're halfway through, and now we're up to number 9, which is the one in the Michigan Mienshao. I never realized how weird that is. The one is from Australia, and his team name has Michigan in it. Anyways, since we're in the top half, this is where I feel like the teams really start to shine, and every team from now on, I think, is pretty good. This team in specific got a grade of B-, and let's talk about it. So there's a lot of really good Pokemon on here. As I move up to these better teams, I'm kind of going to talk more about certain Pokemon in specific, because a lot of the Pokemon on these top half teams are really high quality in my opinion. These coaches, when they were going through the draft, I guess, just gravitated towards some of the Pokemon that in my mind are more dangerous. I'm really a big fan of Mega Scizor, Landorus, T, and Mew for a couple of reasons. They all kind of do something similar in the fact that they can all kind of pivot and all fit under a bulky yet offensive role. All three of them also can be defoggers and hazard management. Two of them, Landorus, T, and Mew, can provide Stealth Rocks. And in addition to that, all of them have setting up as an option for them. They're all setup sweepers. In that sense, I'm also a fan of Superior. It doesn't really get drafted a ton, but I do think it kind of works on this team. The main reason I mentioned Superior, though, is because of its speed, because this team's speed is honestly atrocious. It's my biggest complaint with this team, and it's why it's not higher up on the list. Superior is your fastest Pokemon here, but beyond that, your fastest Pokemon is a base 100, and that's Mew. And I really don't like that, because then it only gets slower and slower from there. There's a couple Pokemon on here that I feel like could be traded out because they don't do a ton for the team. And they could potentially be traded for faster Pokemon, or Pokemon that kind of negate how slow this team is, such as maybe a Sticky Webs user, maybe a Pokemon that's really good at using Tailwind. I don't know, these are just ideas. Maybe something that is really good at Thunder Waving. Regirock and Dusclops, for example, are two Pokemon here that I feel like don't really fit. While Regirock, I understand that this team might feel more comfortable with a better flying resist besides Electivire, I feel like could use something different, something that's faster. You don't really need a Stealth Rock setter, so I don't know, that's just one idea. And then Dusclops doesn't really do a ton. I understand the idea of wanting it to be bulky, but I mean, Mew kind of does a lot of the same things that Dusclops does when it tries to be bulky. Now, obviously, Mew sometimes wants to run offensive sets, and that's totally fine, I get that. But Dusclops, I don't know, like, I feel like something else could go there. That's just me. But let's talk a little bit more about what this team does right, because this team does do a lot of good things. I'm really a big fan of the Fairy Dragon Steel Core, Mega Scizor, Primarina, and Goodra. Everybody should probably know, if you've watched my videos or you know me as a battler, that I love Scizor, and especially Mega Scizor too. I mean, I like both of them a lot. And I think it's a really good Pokemon, and it really kind of fits the playstyle of this team. Those three together are slow, but they're bulky and they hit hard, and they have, you know, exactly the kind of things in their move pools that get the job done. They are generally pretty reliable brings from week to week. You can run a variety of sets on them. I guess Primarina is probably the one that's a little more straightforward. You generally kind of run the same thing with either Scarf or Specs or some other, like, maybe like a damage resist berry or something. And I guess Mega Scizor is a tiny bit one-dimensional, because generally you're going to be bullet punching things. But I mean, Goodra has a great versatile move pool. It can be physical or a special attacker. Assault Vest, Choice Band, Choice Specs. I mean, leftovers. You can really do anything with Goodra, Yachi Berry, you name it. The Fire Water Grass isn't bad either. Serperior, like I said, is a fast Pokemon on this team. I wish there were more fast Pokemon on this team, but I mean, it's good that there is one here. Darmanitan and, again, Primarina. I kind of like how Primarina is an anchor point for these two cores where they kind of converge on one point. And Darmanitan makes for an excellent Scarfer, which this team will need because of its speed issue. I will also say, I kind of already hinted at it before, I'm a fan of this team's hazard control. With Mew, Landorus, T, and Scizor, you have 3 quality defoggers. Serperior as well also gets defog. So this team is in good shape. It also has a decent amount of Pokemon that can set up hazards, and it even has Drapion for Toxic Spikes. And Toxic Spikes will definitely be able to help with all of these Pokemon that can set up, and those will be this team's win conditions, I feel. Landorus T, especially with a Z Crystal, oh my goodness. Mew with Calm Mind or Nasty Plot or whatever. And then Serperior with Leaf Storms and Scizor with Swords Dance, you know, those are pretty quality. You can even rely on Drapion sometimes to whip out the Swords Dance, you never know. So I think there's a lot of quality Pokemon on this team. I'm not a fan, like I said, of Regirock and Dusclops, but besides those two, I think every Pokemon in here is threatening and worth considering if you're preparing against this team. And that's not something you can necessarily say about some of the teams that I've already covered, especially teams lower towards the bottom. There are some picks that just you don't need to be ready for. There are some Pokemon that are so specific and only going to work in some situations, whereas teams like this have Pokemon like, yeah, I need to have a Landorus T answer, I need to have a Mew answer, I need to have a Mega Scizor answer. That's just kind of how this team is built. That's not to say that the other teams lack stuff like that necessarily, it's just some of them don't have as many threats like that as this team does. So yeah, this is a really solid, bulky offensive team. I would like to see more speed. Maybe swap out Regirock for something like Archeops. I'm not looking at the tiers currently. I don't have them pulled up, but that's just an idea maybe. So yeah, good team, and it's only going to get better from here. All right, here at number 8 we have Nico, my boy Nico, and the Phoenix Solrox. He also gets a grade of B- for his team. During Season 1, I was actually pretty impressed with Nico's team, and this team is also pretty good. There's a lot of huge threats on this team that I'm a big fan of. Zygarde 10% is pretty underrated in comparison to its 50% cousin. Victini I love, I think it's really great. I actually haven't really drafted it, but I have built with people that have drafted it. I've used it on the ladder before. I'm a big fan of its wide move pool, and I think it's a great Pokemon. Mega Pinsir is such a huge threat, and I think people have kind of forgotten about it as of late, but it's a huge threat in the Draft League format. And yes, there is that Stealth Rocks problem, but it has the reverse Charizard X effect, where it can kind of wait to Mega Evolve in the right situations because it only takes 25% as opposed to 50%. Something that I commended Nico for in his first team that I will also commend him for here is his type cores. Victini, Tapu Fini, and Ferrothorn is probably one of the best Fire Water Grass cores that we've had so far in this video. If you may remember, I said this in my Season 1 video, but this is kind of how I believe type cores should be built, at least on a team like this. Maybe not if you're trying Stall or Hyper Offense or some other kind of playstyle, but when you have a pretty basic, like, balanced team or bulky offense or bulky defense or whatever kind of playstyle, this is how I think type core should be built. You have Ferrothorn, which is essentially the bulk of the core. He is the most defensive member, and then you have Victini, which is an incredibly offensive member of the team. And then you have Tapu Fini, which can put on some offensive pressure, but is also defensive. So it kind of is the glue between the two. And the two Pokemon on the opposite sides of the spectrum, such as Victini and Ferrothorn, can have traits of the other. For example, Victini can be bulky, you can run it defensively. Ferrothorn can run some attack investment in order to get damage out. It's not like they're completely confined to their roles of being offensive or defensive. And the fact that they can kind of exchange that and aren't locked into roles is what makes them fluid as a type core. What I also like is that he actually has the same exact thing with Fairy Dragon Steel, because Tapu Fini and Ferrothorn are also part of that, except the offensive end is switched out with Zygarde 10%. Zygarde 10% can't exactly do the same thing Victini can in terms of being defensive, but it just kind of goes to show how there's a defensive end to the spectrum and an offensive end to the spectrum, but unlike other teams where it feels very separate and chopped up and mishmashed together, this team feels like it's fluid, like those Pokemon connect and have synergy in a way that's organic and it makes sense. So I love the cores here, and this team actually has fantastic speed tiers. I've been grilling a lot of teams up until now about their speeds, but this team has Tornadus T, it has Zygarde 10%, it has Electabuzz, it has Mega Pinsir, and then even Pokemon below that, such as Victini. You know, Tapu Fini isn't terribly slow, neither is Mesprit. Hitmonlee with Unburden. This team has Alolan Muck, and for some of the teams so far, that would be like their 6th fastest Pokemon. Maybe not actually, but you understand what I'm trying to say here. And every Pokemon here is pretty good. Mesprit, Muck, Electabuzz, these are all kind of lower tier picks, but they're still pretty valuable, especially Electabuzz. I really like the Electabuzz pick here. It's a fast electric, but it also has the bulk that this team might need in certain situations. Kangaskhan is the only kind of pick, like I could do without it, but it also can be kind of impressive, and it has a pretty wide move pool, and I think sometimes it's even underrated. But there are pitfalls with this team. There are things that it doesn't do great. A lot of it, in my mind, is actually the lack of fulfilling potential. As in, it's not that Nico did things bad, it's just he could have done things better. For example, Tapu Fini is on the team, and normally you can kind of play around with Misty Terrain, but I feel like this features a lot of Pokemon that don't capitalize on it. Tornadus T, for example, Mega Pinsir, and Mesprit are all off the ground and therefore susceptible to status. Normally you kind of draft Tapu Fini and then a bunch of things on the ground so that they're protected, but these 3 Pokemon are Pokemon that can be statused, and people can still bring Toxic or Thunder Wave against them, and they will be affected. And they're Pokemon that really don't appreciate status, especially Mega Pinsir. Essentially, Tapu Fini only feels like it's been drafted because of its typing and the fact that it gets defog, not because it's a complete component in this team. Yes, I did mention how it fits wonderfully with the type cores here, but that more has to do with its typing and less because of the terrain. It's basically a lack of capitalizing on something that could have made this team better. Essentially, because he didn't capitalize on it, I feel like it separates this team from being perfect to just being great. This team also has an overwhelming problem with ice. There is Victini and there is Tapu Fini, but from there, the ice resists run out. You have Zygarde 10%, which isn't going to take any ice attack, and then you have Tornadus T, which is your Z user, and Pinsir, which is your Mega, all Pokemon that are very valuable to the team as a whole, but are going to be worn down by ice moves. Ferrothorn, which is your Steel type, is also your Grass type, and that means you're going to be taking neutral damage, and your Steel type isn't there to resist ice like it normally would be on another team. There are ways for Nico to get around this, but it just kind of shows that ice is going to be a huge problem. So those are my main complaints here. The fact that some of these Pokemon don't exactly work 100% perfectly with the team. Mainly that Tapu Fini thing. I feel like it's really strange that Tapu Fini is kind of preventing his own team from using status. Meanwhile, people can still use status on him. Because there are Pokemon on here that could benefit from being able to throw off status if Tapu Fini wasn't in the picture, such as Ferrothorn. But because Tapu Fini is an integral part of the team, and he needs it for defog, it just ends up being really strange because he also needs Tornadus T and Pinsir and Mesprit to not be statused. And I guess my last point of criticism would be that Tapu Fini is the only real quality hazard remover here. It's one of the best, but it's one of the only ones, and normally you would want more hazard protection for Mega Pinsir. So those are my thoughts on Nico's team. There's only those 3 nitpicks mainly, but overall it's a really great team. Up next, we have Ace23, who is coaching the London Knights, and if you may remember, that's actually Stromfel's team from Season 1. He's taking over the team. Ace23, I gave him a B rating for this team, so he moved up from a B-, and he is our 7th place team for this power ranking video. Unlike all of these coaches that I've covered up until now, I've become familiar with all of them, but Ace23, I didn't really know going into this. He's kind of a new face in this group. Fortunately, he took the initiative to kind of DM me some of his explanations for his team, and so I took some of that into account because I don't really know his playstyle or how he thinks as a player, and that was able to help me form some opinions about his team. So first of all, I gotta say that this team is pretty well constructed. It has a lot of offensive potential, and I'm a big fan of that. I like seeing the Mega Lopunny, the Blacephalon, especially with the Z Crystal, Zapdos, Hydreigon, all really hard hitters. Even Nihilego, which is an additional beast booster, and the fact that this team has 2 beast boosters in Blacephalon and Nihilego is really cool, and it can lead to a lot of sweeps. This team has great Volt Turn. It has a great Volt Turn core. Hydreigon and Zapdos work wonderfully together. I can say that with experience because I've used those 2 together, and they're incredible. Yes, they do share a similar ice weakness, but the fact that they can both provide a ground immunity for ground weak Pokemon on the team while also pivoting around is really clutch. And they can also both defog now. So that's really cool because they are essentially a Volt Turn core that can also take turns defogging from week to week. The Fairy Dragon Steel core, it's pretty nice. You've got Hydreigon, Whimsicott, and Bronzong. Whimsicott I feel kind of about, and that's also for where it fits into for the Fire, Water, Grass core, but we'll get into that in a moment. I do like Bronzong as a pick here. Because he does have those 2 ground immunities like I explained earlier, he can get away with trying to pull off Heat Proof sometimes, so I think that's pretty cool. Bronzong is a great Stealth Rocker for this team, and I actually think that this team could use maybe another Stealth Rocker, but that's just my opinion. But Bronzong does fit its niche nicely, and I think that that's a pretty solid Fairy Dragon Steel core. Fire, Water, Grass, I don't know, it's a little strange. Blacephalon, Gastrodon, and Whimsicott are all kind of on different wavelengths. Blacephalon is really, really offensive and fragile. Whimsicott is fragile and fast, but is more support instead of offense. And then Gastrodon is full defense, like full blown. I guess you can also count Levany as part of the grass core, but it kind of fits the same description as Whimsicott. It's kind of fast, and it mainly provides support. But that core isn't bad by any means. I just have little nitpicks about it. Gastrodon, while it's a pretty good bulky water, I feel like will struggle on this team just a bit because of its typing. Being the only water type on the team and having to take certain attacks for some of these Pokemon, it's going to be hindered by the fact that people can prepare for it by bringing like Hidden Power Grass or Grass Knot or Energy Ball. And like how I was talking about Nico's team when it comes to Ferrothorn, here you have a case again where it's a Pokemon that should be an Ice Resist. This is your water type, but it's not because of its ground typing. And while I understand the importance of having a ground type to stop electric spam, in this situation, you know, you have Hydreigon and Zapdos both weak to ice, and I would like to see more Pokemon on here that do resist ice. Gastrodon cannot be a reliable ice answer on this team. A lot of pressure is put on Bronzong to do that, and I think maybe another Pokemon could fit on here that could take some of that pressure off. I do like the Sticky Webs, or the addition of Sticky Webs on this team with Levany, because this team already does have pretty decent speed tiers. Whimsicott, Blacephalon, and Nihilego are all breaking that threshold of base 100 speed, which is in my mind the speed that you want to have a couple Pokemon above. And he also has some mid-range. He has Zapdos, he has Hydreigon, he has Heracross. We also can't forget Megalopony, which is incredibly fast. And the fact that he has Levany, which can set up webs, means that Blacephalon can sometimes be modest instead of timid, or Lopunny can be adamant instead of jolly. So offensively, like I said, I'm a big fan of a lot of the Pokemon on here. I think Hydreigon and Zapdos are very versatile, even though they seem one-dimensional on the surface, and they're both pretty hard hitters. I like that Nihilego and Blacephalon are both here to kind of be special attacking beast boosters. That is one thing I will say. This team leads kind of heavily on the special attacking side. If you look at this graphic in specific, all of these top 6 Pokemon here are special attackers, and they're some of the strongest Pokemon on this team. Gastrodon isn't known for its attacking prowess, but generally it'll be running Scald and maybe Earth Power or Ice Beam sometimes. In terms of dedicated physical attackers, we only really have Lopunny and Heracross. Levany and Zangoose, I mean, they're kind of lower tier picks anyways, and I'm not even that big of a fan of Zangoose to begin with because it kind of only does the same things that Lopunny does. Not to mention Heracross is also just an additional fighting type like Lopunny. So I would like to see maybe some different variations. I feel like sometimes you might have to run physical Hydreigon just to break through special walls, because this team can be walled specially sometimes. So there is a bit of an ice issue, like I said. That's what I was talking about when I was mentioning Gastrodon. I do think this team could use maybe another Stealth Rock setter. There's a lot of pressure on Bronzong to be both the Ice Resist and the Stealth Rock setter, and because of the fact that there's no real way for Bronzong to recover outside of leftovers, I would like to see maybe some other Pokemon on this team that can take the pressure off. And I think maybe trading off Zangoose might be the way to go. because like I said, it doesn't bring a ton to the table that Lopunny isn't already doing a better job of anyways. I don't really have the answers as into what to pick up specifically. I'm not even sure if there's anything still even on the table that fills that role, but in my mind, I think that something else on here should maybe set up some other type of hazard. Maybe not Stealth Rocks, but maybe some type of spike user, and something that can resist ice perhaps. And overall, those are kind of my thoughts on the team. It's a wonderfully offensive team, but it also has some bulk where it needs it. It has a defensive backbone that it can fall back on in a pinch. Sometimes you can run bulky Zapdos, bulky Hydreigon, Whimsicott with, status support, Leech Seed, Gastrodon, and Bronzong are great bulky Pokemon. So this team can play on either side of the playstyle spectrum, no matter what. And yeah, those are my thoughts on this team. Placing here at number 6, we have Gengar Raichu and the Route 1 Raichus. I love your logo, by the way. It's adorable. For his draft, we actually gave him a B+ rating, so it's another step up here. Some people I know are instantly going to complain about this team because yes, it is a Koko Lucha team. It has Tapu Koko and Hawlucha, and in addition it also has Beedrill. And I think it's that addition of Beedrill that kind of puts it above the step of normally just a general Tapu Koko Hawlucha team. Because Tapu Koko and Beedrill essentially create such an intense Volt Turn core that it's kind of unbeatable. I mean, priority is obviously the way that you could try to beat it because these are both fast and frail, but the fact that they can just kind of dance circles around any Pokemon and be able to pivot out is really impressive. I feel like Tapu Koko was the obvious captain choice here, so I'm glad that he chose it. And yeah, while Tapu Koko, Hawlucha, and Beedrill together are pretty predictable, you can't deny that they're good and they work well together. It's a popular, I guess, quote-unquote gimmick for a reason, and you have to give it credit. The Fairy Dragon Steel Core is present. It's not perfect, but it is here and it's decent. You have Tapu Koko, Empoleon, and Druddigon, and what I do like about this core, while it does dip into some lower tiers to fill it out, it's good because of hazard management. You have Tapu Koko, which is going to be defogging, Empoleon, which is defogging and Stealth Rock setting, and Druddigon, which is the Stealth Rock setter. So you kind of cover your bases with this core that kind of fits together pretty well. One of my biggest complaints about this team is that it tries to get away with not having a grass type. I think I've remembered Gengar Raichu saying he doesn't think grass types are that good. Or maybe that was young Bisharp, I honestly can't remember. But essentially what you have here is Incineroar and Empoleon, but then no grass type to turn to. Functionally on this team, Beedrill is kind of the grass type because, and I know that sounds really weird, but it's kind of the grass type here because it shares a lot of the same weaknesses and is going to be covered in about the same ways by these two Pokemon, but it doesn't really fit the way that a grass type should exactly. It's not going to cover the same weaknesses for those two Pokemon as it normally would. The hazard controlling, like I said, is pretty great here. Empoleon, we already know it's the best defogger, shouts out to MV. Hitmonchan is a great rapid spinner, very underrated. Tapu Koko can defog when needed, especially because of its speed. It enables it to get in and get off an emergency defog in certain situations. And yeah, you have some quality Stealth Rock setters, including Necrozma. There is some versatility on here in terms of the move pools. Like I just mentioned, Necrozma, Hoopa Unbound, Snorlax, they have very wide move pools and can pull off a lot of different attacks in terms of typing. Hitmonchan and Incineroar even get some really niche moves, like Incineroar gets Leech Life, Hitmonchan gets like the Elemental Punches, all moves that are like really like, whoa, what the hell? And I'm a big fan of the Ditto pick here. Ditto is a great Pokemon, and a lot of things that will be facing Gengar Raichu will maybe have to try and set up to beat some of the Pokemon on here, such as Tapu Koko. You might need to set up a speed, like you might need the Dragon Dance, for example. Same with Beedrill. And Ditto can kind of counter those Pokemon by saying, well, I'm going to steal your Dragon Dance and I'm going to Choice Scarf it. So you can essentially counter sweep with Ditto and prevent people from just kind of trying to set up with speed-based boosting moves to surpass the speed of your really fast Pokemon. Pretty much every Pokemon on here is great, and I think that's one of the highlights of this team. The fact that every Pokemon on here in the right conditions can be a threat. No Pokemon on here really feels like a tier 5 or tacked on, you know what I mean? Hitmonchan, for example, is one of the greatest tier 5s available, in my opinion. Every Pokemon on here is a threat to some capacity and needs to be prepared for. But this team does lack some synergy. It can't just rely on an amazing Volt Turn core to succeed. Missing that grass type really does suck. Doubling up types, for example, with Necrozma and Hoopa Unbound is kind of unfortunate. Also, the fact that Hoopa Unbound and Incineroar do share the dark typing. While they don't really share weaknesses, it is kind of important to notice. And another issue with this team is its weakness to ground. It's not a huge weakness. There's only a handful of Pokemon on this team that are actually weak to ground, being Incineroar, Empoleon, and Tapu Koko. But there's one ground immunity, and it's Hawlucha. And Hawlucha generally you're only going to bring in when the time is right to go for an Electric Seed Unburden Sweep. And for this team, I feel like it needs something else to kind of take ground attacks. And guess what would normally be doing that? Your Grass type, which is not here on the team. There is a reason why in OU, Zygarde 50% kind of rules the meta, and Tangrowth is the one that stops it, because it's a bulky defensive grass type, and it's built to take those ground type attacks. I'm not saying that Gengar Raichu needs Tangrowth per se, but I do think that a grass type helps this team. That might, in the long run, kind of hurt the situation that his team's in, where every Pokemon on here is a threat, but for overall synergy, I think it could be helpful. But I wouldn't encourage Gengar Raichu to just immediately make the trade. I would maybe see how the team works, because there are threats on here, and they're pretty big ones. So I would give it a shot, but if you feel overwhelmed by ground types, or if you feel like there's some type of type imbalance in your team, I would maybe try and trade something out for a really reliable, strong grass type. And so those are my thoughts on Gengar Raichu's team. Tapu Koko and Hawlucha, very controversial, I know. A lot of people really aren't a fan of that core. Some people think it's pretty gimmicky, some people just really don't like playing it, but there's a reason why people don't like playing it, and there's a reason people don't like facing it, because it's a pretty good combo at the end of the day, and if people don't have a reliable answer for it, they're going to get swept under the rug. So now we're entering in the top 5 of this season's power rankings, and in my mind, these top 5 teams are the ones that stand out the most to be as being really impressive. This team right here, Fadaki, or as I call him, Zach, because I know him in real life, I gave him a grade of A-. So starting off, I just need to jump out immediately with the Fairy Dragon Steel core. Zygarde 50%, Scizor, and Florges is beautiful. I think these three work really great together, and they're 3 really high-quality Pokemon in my opinion. They all kind of function under the same playstyle. They're all somewhat bulky, but they also have the potential to set up. Actually, all 3 of them do. I was going to say just Scizor and Zygarde, but Florges can even Calm Mind, and sometimes that's enough for it to win games. This team has hazard removal like it's nobody's business. Like, he drafted hazard removal like he has 3 Talonflames on the team. I'm dead serious. He's got Scizor and Florges and Rotom Heat for Defog, and then Tentacruel for Rapid Spin. I mean, even Aerodactyl gets Defog if you want to go there. In terms of Stealth Rock, he does have it in Aerodactyl and Azelf, but that kind of feels really unfortunate here, because they don't really want to run Stealth Rock, and they can, but it would be better, I think, if something more defensive had it. That's just my opinion, though. It's not like he's without Stealth Rock, it's just he kind of has to sacrifice coverage in some situations for Stealth Rocks. But there is Tentacruel, which is a highlight because it can send out Toxic Spikes, and that's always valuable, especially for a team like this that can rely on setup sleepers such as Zygarde 50% and Scizor. It reminds me of what I was saying about the Ones team where he has Drapion, and they were very effective in setting up Toxic Spikes and chipping down the opposition for the sweep. And I feel like this team also does something very similar, with Tentacruel being the Toxic Spike setter. While some of the more obvious Z-Crystal users on here are maybe Azelf or Zygarde 50%, I'm kind of glad that he split it up between 2 Pokemon. Virizion I really feel like needed the boost, whereas Zygarde 50% doesn't always need the Z-move. Yeah, it helps out in a lot of situations, but sometimes Virizion needs the extra damage because it doesn't have it immediately. That Z Stone Edge or that Z Focus Blast can sometimes be the difference maker. And let me not get too much further before talking about Mega Aerodactyl. Incredibly underrated Pokemon, and it really helps out his speed tiers. There are some above 100 Pokemon on here, such as Azelf and Virizion, but from there, the speed kind of peters out. But this really intense, fast Pokemon in Mega Aerodactyl, which has insane damage, will really help him out in the long run because people won't just be able to try and speed creep the Azelf and then outspeed the whole team. There's still Mega Aerodactyl that you have to worry about. This team also has a good amount of bulk, and I feel like this is also a team where it can play kind of all ends of the spectrum of playstyles really well. Because, yeah, you have some really offensive mons like Aerodactyl, Zygarde 50%, Scizor, Azelf, even Virizion. But then you have these defensive Pokemon. You've got Florges, you've got Tentacruel, Porygon 2. That thing is like what I think of when I think of defensive Pokemon sometimes. Rotom Heat can be very bulky and can whittle the opposing team down with Will-O-Wisp. And again, unlike other teams where it kind of feels like very separate from each other, these Pokemon feel like they fit together in the sense that even though they're kind of representing different playstyles, they can still form harmony on this team together. The webs do help this team on Swadloon, but I do need to talk about Swadloon. I was kind of giving Zach or Fadaki some advice on his team towards the end, and I did say that he needed a dark type, and I did say that he needed a sticky web user. Because sticky webs do kind of help the speed problem. He does actually have some priority on this team on his slower Pokemon, such as Zygarde 50% with extreme speed and Scizor with bullet punch, but still the fact remains that webs are going to be a help. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with Swadloon. It's really cool. Okay, I'll give him that. Like, to break the facade of trying to be very professional, I actually love that he drafted Swadloon. But to be fair and to be critical, a better Pokemon could be there. I just have to be factual. This team has amazing cores, it has great setup potential, it's bulky and it's offensive. This team is essentially a Swiss Army knife. It's a jack of all trades, and it can kind of do anything. And if Zach is creative and brings the right sets and brings the right Pokemon each week, I think he can rack up a lot of wins with this team. Even Malamar, and I actually recommended Malamar to him. I don't think Malamar's that bad. It's a little bit lackluster in comparison to the rest of the team, but in certain situations it can be a great sweeper, and it kind of has pretty good all-around stats. At least for the tier that it's in. And the fact that it can, you know, just run Scarf Superpower, or I mean, doesn't even need Scarf Superpower. You can run Rest Sleep Talk with Knockoff and Superpower and just get boosts passively that way. I think this team is full of a lot of really good Pokemon and full of a lot of threats. And it's just, man, Swadloon and Malamar only subtract points just a little bit. It's only because from here on, the other teams are really stellar that Zach isn't placed any higher. So yeah, good job, good team, big fan of it. Get some wins with Scizor for me, you know I love him, and yeah. Now we're moving up to J Creams, who I also gave an A-, and he is at number 4. If you guys don't remember, J Creams was actually who I gave the number 1 spot to in my Season 1 power rankings. And he's still pretty high. I don't want it to get confused that I don't think that he's like number 1 anymore, because this team is great. It's just there's so many good teams. It was pretty hard to place all of these teams, and I had to move them around for like days before I finally found a list that I could agree with. Anyways, that's enough about the other teams. Let's talk about Jay's team, because this is where we're at right now. This is a wonderfully balanced team, and that's something I could have said about his last season team as well. This team focuses, I think, a tiny bit more on defense than his previous team, but it's really impressive to me, even still. I am a huge, huge fan of Tangrowth, Arcanine, and Mega Blastoise. They're all bulky, they all have offensive potential, they all have defensive potential, they just all feel like they really were meant to be on the same team together. This team also has some incredible Volt Turn. He has Mienshao and Jolteon, which are both really fast and help out his speed tiers, and they also kind of pivot around. It was a little bit like how I was mentioning with Gengaraichu's team. They're incredibly fast, and they're great pivots. The same kind of thing applies here, except these Pokemon aren't as fast, but they're still great Pokemon nonetheless, Mienshao and Jolteon being able to Volt Switch and U-turn. And it should also be mentioned that Mienshao forming a Regenerator core with Tangrowth. For a team with so many cores, though, it is a little bit disappointing that this team lacks a Dragon type. I would have liked to see a Dragon type in some capacity. Clefable and Registeel really feel like they're kind of missing something on this team, like maybe a Haxorus. I mean, I know that the draft kind of went the way it did, and people might have got sniped or cut out of things, and maybe Jay really was planning to get a Dragon type, but I really feel like this team is kind of missing the dragon quite heavily. But that's just my opinion. I think the dragon typing is a great typing, and missing out on it, especially when you have the other two components of the core that it belongs to, is a tiny bit disappointing. That's one of my biggest complaints about the team. But in terms of more things that Jay did get right, I am a fan of these really fast Pokemon that make up the team. The Jolteon, the Mienshao, which I mentioned already, the Alakazam, and the Ambipom, all of which get some really wide move pools, and their speed means that they can run all sorts of coverage and act as really strong revenge killers. This team can position itself really well with the Volt Turn core as well, in a way that Gengar Raichu's team necessarily can't, where it can bring in some of these bulky Pokemon really safely to take hits while dealing a bunch of damage. Jolteon can, Volt Switch into Tangrowth to take a hit. Then Tangrowth can switch out into Mienshao to get some offensive pressure going, while healing itself with Regenerator. Then Mienshao can U-turn and get some health back as well and go into Arcanine to Intimidate. Like, this is just an example of how that could go. The Z users are kind of meh. The Z users, they're okay. Ambipom is a pretty cool Pokemon. I can appreciate that he put a Z Crystal on it, that he has the faith in it, but, I mean, there are Pokemon on here that could have used a Z Crystal better, in my opinion. I'm mainly looking at that Alakazam. And then Golurk is alright. I feel like Golurk doesn't bring a ton to the table for this team, but I can appreciate the fact that he needed a ground type. And for low budget ground type, he got a pretty good one. Golurk can put in some work. It's another good Stealth Rock setter, so I can't complain too much. It is a little weird that he put the Z Crystal on it, but I mean, it does get a pretty wide move pool, so I mean, who knows? Maybe it'll surprise me. One Pokemon I kind of don't like on here is Golbat. I understand why Golbat was drafted. He did need a quality defogger, and if you look at his team, his only real hazard remover is Blastoise. But see, his team wasn't desperate for hazard removal like some of the other teams are. If you look at his team, really, Arcanine is the only thing weak to Stealth Rocks. And then you even have Pokemon like Tangrowth and Mienshao, which are going to be regenerating health upon switching out. So they're not as pressured by the Stealth Rocks to avoid switching out, because that means you have to switch back in to take damage, because they gain health back when they switch out. And so I feel like the addition of Golbat, it adds an extra hazard remover so that Blastoise doesn't always have to have Rapid Spin, but it also adds another Stealth Rock weakness, so it kind of feels weird to me. That's basically what I'm trying to say. I feel like a bit of a hypocrite because I do have a team like this up so high with only having 2 hazard removers, and one of them is kind of lackluster, but like I said, I feel like this team doesn't necessarily need the hazard removal like other ones do. You can even look to Clefable and Alakazam, who have Magic Guard and aren't going to be taking rocks damage at all. So I understand why you picked it, but maybe I think you should try and switch it out for some other type of hazard remover. That's just my opinion. Because Golbat, I don't think, brings anything else to the table besides being a defogger. I guess I can also understand maybe having it as a ground immunity, since Tangrowth is your really only ground switch in, but it is a really good ground switch in. So, I don't know. But overall, this team really is great. Clefable is an amazing Pokemon. Tangrowth, Arcanine, Jolteon, Alakazam, Mienshao, I think all of those have kind of proven their worth in the leagues that I've been in, and I've seen them do great things. And there are some Pokemon on here like Ambipom and Mega Blastoise that don't exactly get to shine all the time. Not like they're even on the same level. I shouldn't say it like that. Ambipom and Blastoise exist on very different wavelengths, but neither of them get talked about a lot, is basically what I'm trying to say. And I do trust Jade kind of to use all these Pokemon on here to their full potential. I just think there was a couple missteps in terms of the drafting. Like, if you look at the top 6, plus maybe Registeel, I think that team is amazing. I mean, I guess you need to add Mega Blastoise into that equation as well to get the type cores really going. It's just like, giving the Z Crystal to Ambipom and to Golurk, and an addition of Golbat is really my complaints with this team. Everything else I think is fantastic. So good job to Jay Creams. I'm wishing him good luck this season, and we'll see how this team goes. Maybe he'll prove me wrong about Golbat and Golurk and Ambipom. Who knows? I haven't watched any of the Week 1 battles, so he might have won with, like, Z Ambipom. Who knows? Moving up the chain, we're really getting down to the wire. We're at number 3 with Blake Trout and the Mistralton Swannas, and his team also got an A-. Blake's team is really interesting. I think people might criticize me for putting another Mega Audino team as high as I am, but I'm willing to live with that because I do think Mega Audino is underrated, and in a situation like this where you get a lot of points for drafting a Mega that low, I think it's worth it, especially with a team like this. Like, this is what you end up with. Blake, in my opinion, has some of the scariest type cores in the entire league here. Latios, Jirachi, and Mega Audino, those three together are going to function really well, and like I said with Nico's team, this is how I believe you should build type cores. Audino is very defensive, and it falls within that range. Latios is very offensive. It's the more offensive counterpart to Latias. That's a very intentional decision. And then Jirachi is kind of the middle ground. It's the bulky, every stat is 100, but it also means that it can put out some offensive pressure if needed to. And Jirachi acts as the binding glue for Latios and Audino to work on the same core together. The fact that all three of these can Calm Mind kind of says something about the setup potential of this team as well. Let's also not forget that the fact that Volcarona is here, which can Quiver Dance, Mismagius, which can Nasty Plot, Scrafty, which can Dragon Dance, Silvally, which can Swords Dance. It just goes on and on. There's lots of versatility in these Pokemon and what they can do. Latios, Jirachi, Mismagius, Scrafty even, they all get very wide move pools. Shaman even kind of has some diversity in which you don't see with a ton of grass types, like it gets Earth Power and Air Slash and Dazzling Gleam. And then there's Silvally, which really kind of fits the team together because it can fulfill so many different roles by changing its type. And this team really appreciates the extra pivoting that it can do and the extra bulk that it can do, and I feel like it can fulfill a lot of roles just by being there. And it's so versatile in the fact that it can change its typing, and that kind of just fits to the whole theme of versatility on this team. In my mind, this team needs another Stealth Rocker. That's one of my biggest complaints. Jirachi is the only one. Now, this team puts out very consistent damage without it, and there are other methods for whittling the opponent down, such as Toxapex with Toxic Spikes. Probably one of the best Toxic Spike setters in the game. But I do wish maybe there was something else on here that set up rocks for Blake in order to chip down the opponent for some of these Pokemon that have huge sweeping potential, but need the extra damage on some things. Volcarona, for example, which occasionally struggles with fire types, could really appreciate fire types being chipped down by Stealth Rock. The speed tiers do lack a tiny bit, and again, I feel like a little bit of a hypocrite because I've been drilling teams up until now for not having wonderful speed tiers, but I feel like it's workable on this team. You have Latios and Mismagius as the only two Pokemon that surpass the 100 range, and not having anything above 110 is a little bit unfortunate, I'm not going to lie. But there's a lot of base 100s on here. You have Shaman, Jirachi, and Volcarona, and all of them are comfortable with increasing their speed if need be. Namely Jirachi with a Choice Scarf, it's very famous for running that, and Volcarona by Quiver Dancing. So there are ways to increase the speed on this team. Also, I should mention Scrafty with Dragon Dance. Can't forget about that. Rotom Fan has been known to run Choice Scarf when it does come to battles. I know Rotom Fan is kind of like an iffy pick for some people, but as an electric type and a budget electric type at that, without adding to any type of ground weakness, I think it's a really good pick, specifically in tandem with Toxapex, and the fact that it's a defogger. Providing that ground immunity for Toxapex is really key, and being a pivot to bring in Toxapex and then get Regenerator is another added benefit. Typing wise, this team does also struggle a little bit with Dark type. Honestly, the Stealth Rock issue is probably my biggest complaint, and the Dark type issue is my second biggest complaint. Latios, Jirachi, and Mismagius are all weak to Dark, and also all weak to Ghost if you really think about it. These are some of the best Pokemon on the team, and they would appreciate some type of help with that. Scrafty is the immediate answer you think of, but Scrafty can't pull the weight for all of these Pokemon in my mind. Audino is another way to handle both of those types, being a fairy type to attack dark types and a normal type to be immune to ghosts. But again, Audino might be too busy doing other things, healing up other members of the team. It can't always run Dazzling Gleam to put on offensive pressure against dark types, or to even try and damage ghost types. But to Blake's credit, Volcarona is a good weapon against dark types, The problem is it's not always going to want to come in, because generally when Volcarona comes in, it's going to try and sweep you. You don't really bring it in prematurely all the time. But with those two criticisms, I can't emphasize enough how threatening Blake's team is, even in spite of them. You do have to remember, type resist berries are a thing. Latios and Jirachi can easily run Colbur Berry. It's not a big deal. You can't necessarily expect to Pursuit Trap this team just because it's weak to Dark, because there are ways for him to get around that. Volcarona, being a Z user, is incredibly deadly. I can say for certain now because I've used Volcarona. And yeah, it does have that Stealth Rock weakness, but he does have some good defoggers on here. Latios and Savali are obviously the main ones here, but they're very quality defoggers, and they will be able to remove hazards for Volcarona when needed, and Volcarona will be able to pick up a lot of kills, I'm pretty sure of it. So yeah, there's a ton of move versatility here. The cores are really threatening, and a lot of Pokemon on here are just flat out threats. So I'm a big fan of this team. I want to see Blake do well. I didn't mention that Slacking. It's a bit of an odd pick. Maybe he could swap it out for another Stealth Rocker. That's what I would do in my opinion. But that's just me. It might just be dead weight if he's never actually going to bring a tier 5 Stealth Rocker. He might as well just bring something that can, do hella damage to one game if it's worth it. So now we're going to be moving on to the top 2 teams, and it was really hard to make decisions on these final 2. If you've been keeping track and you've been watching the whole time, you might have realized which 2 names I haven't mentioned yet, and so it's a bit of a drum roll moment to decide who I gave first place and who I gave second place, because obviously when you see who I gave second place, you'll know who I gave first place. But I do want you guys to understand, I consider these teams on almost equal footing. It was really, really hard for me to pick one over the other, and it took me like a whole day to finally decide. So without further ado, let's move on to the top 2 teams of this power rankings. So at number 2, we have my boy Stromful, and this team gets an A+. So does the first team. Like I said, I do consider these teams kind of on the same level, but yeah, they both get A+ from me. I think these are phenomenal teams. Stromful has perhaps the most threatening Fairy Dragon Steel core I've ever seen. Mega Diancie, Garchomp with a Z move, and Celesteela work phenomenally. It's so beautiful. For the third time, let me reiterate. In terms of how cores work, Celesteela, really great defensive Pokemon. Diancie, very fragile offensive Pokemon. And then you have Garchomp, which meets in the middle. It can be bulky, it can run, those defensive sets with Rocky Helmet and Rough Skin, or it can be really offensive with Choice Scarf or Swords Dance and a Z move. It's the perfect middle ground, and it ties both of their worlds together. And those 3 are phenomenal, and I can't even believe that he has all 3 on the same team. Even the Fire Water Grass core is good. He has Roserade, Milotic, and Greninja. I do like that double water because they fulfill different roles. Greninja being the offensive member, and Milotic being the defensive member. And then you have Moltres, which is kind of an underrated pick. I'm still not 100% sold on it necessarily, but it does have an undeniably high base stat total. It's in the same family as Zapdos, so you have to give it credit. And if you're not bringing your fire type to every single game, when you do bring it, I guess you might as well have a good one. The problem is it is obviously going to be discouraged by rocks, but fortunately for Stromful's team, nothing else is really threatened greatly by rocks. This team has great hazard setting options. He has his Stealth Rockers in Garchomp and Diancie. He's got Spikes and Toxic Spikes in Roserade and Greninja. He does have a bit of a problem with removing hazards. Rotom is really his only actual defogger. But like I said, his team doesn't necessarily need Stealth Rocks gone, and in most situations, defogging is kind of hindering him because he's going to want a Spike stack, he's going to want a Hazard stack, because of the way his team is set up. Getting damage in to sweep with these Pokemon is going to be key for Stromful, and preventing that from happening is going to be key for his opponents. You might feel relieved when Greninja, for example, goes for Spikes instead of trying to kill you outright, but all of a sudden, once you have a full set of hazards on your side of the field and you can't remove them, and your Pokemon are just dying left and right to a beast-boosting Celesteela, that's when it becomes a problem, and it's already too late at that point. This is one of the only situations where the lack of hazard removal actually helps Stromful, because he isn't going to be tempted to remove his own hazards, which will actually probably be helping him, as opposed to opposing hazards hurting him. The only situation where Stromful will be disadvantaged by having hazards on his side of the field if there are an equal amount of hazards on both sides of the field, Stromful will be in a bit of a bind and would appreciate the defog. But I don't think any other team in the league can hazard stack as well as this team can. Overall, this team just has a little bit of everything. It has your hyper offense, Diancie and Garchomp, even Greninja in a sense, and then it has your defense. You've got Milotic, you've got Celesteela, you've got Reuniclus, and then you kind of have this middle ground area that kind of contains Roserade and Rotom. I can even group in Reuniclus there, in the sense that it can be really offensive if it wants to, but also very defensive. I'm a big fan of the Licky Licky pick. I actually did tempt him to pick it up because I think it's great having a Wish Passer on this team with some of these Pokemon not being able to heal themselves, such as Garchomp and Celesteela. The fact that Licky Licky is here to provide longevity to the team, I think is very helpful. And overall, this team is just really impressive. I could just keep talking over and over again about how this guy has Z Garchomp and Mega Diancie and Celesteela on the same team. And Diancie was instrumental in Stromful's almost clean sweep of Season 1. He did end up losing in playoffs, but during the regular season he went undefeated, and a big key to that was Mega Diancie. And because this team works so well around Mega Diancie, I can see Stromful having a lot of success with this team. This team even manages to fit in a meme pick in Goomy, and I will say I'm a tiny bit disappointed by it. Don't get me wrong, I love Goomy, I love that it's here, but I have been giving crap to everybody so far that's kind of done a meme pick. I did say props to Eevee for picking Eevee, but I mean, he could have used something better there. Fadaki picked Swadloon, and here we have Goomy. I do wish that there was something else there, I guess is all I'm trying to say. Overall, this team is just fantastic. I can't say enough good things about it, and I could probably go on forever explaining the intricacies of this team, the way they fit together, even the Pokemon that don't seem like they fit exactly perfectly. Again, having Greninja on the same team as a Milotic and a Celesteela, isn't that stacking up a bunch of electric weaknesses? You would think so, but having Roserade as, you know, something that can be defensive, or Garchomp as one of the best ground types in the game, it kind of mitigates it. I see a lot of Pokemon on here rising up to be unexpected threats, because, like I said, Celesteela, Garchomp, and Diancie are so scary. I see Greninja and Reuniclus putting in a lot of work and a lot of damage when people are too sidetracked on these bigger threats. So those are my thoughts on Stromful's team. I think this is a wonderful team. I think it's going to do really well, and that's why I gave it an A+ rating. To me, this is one of the two best teams in the league. At least on paper, that is. We need to see if Stromful is able to repeat his success from Season 1. And finally, at number 1, we have Luke and the Humilau Hustlers. This team obviously also got an A+ grade from me. Straight off the bat, I just need to get right into it. This team has an amazing Fairy Dragon Steel core in Mega Gardevoir, Heatran, and Kyurem. Kyurem and Mega Gardevoir, I think, are generally considered underrated, in my opinion, and I do think that they're very good Pokemon that can be very, very successful. Specifically in this situation, I feel like Mega Gardevoir was a bit of a steal for the tier that it was in. It fits very well, and it's very offensive. Even though it only hits the base 100 speed, it hits incredibly hard, and that Fairy Psychic typing is very good. It can put in a lot of damage against a lot of different types. And one of the types that really can't do anything to is Steel types, but then Heatran is there. And it's so nice that it fits in as a Steel type for that core, but also as a Fire type for the Fire, Water, Grass core, which we'll talk about in a minute. Kyurem having a Z-Crystal may seem a little bit weird on the surface, but because of its move pool, it's actually really good, and being able to throw off Z-Draco Meteors is obviously always a good thing. Over on the Fire, Water, Grass core, I think it's one of the best you could possibly do. Manaphy and Heatran are top tier threats, and Heatran kind of ties both of the type cores together. Manaphy is a huge threat. In my opinion, it's one of the best Pokemon in the format. It has lost a little bit of its shine entering into Gen 7, but you can't deny that a Tail Glow is incredibly scary with a Manaphy, and because of its move pool, it can just sweep teams. Serena, I mean, you guys already know it's one of the best Rapid Spinners in the game, but it does fit nicely with these two Pokemon, and being able to pivot is always a good thing. Speaking of pivoting, we have Raikou here, which is one of the faster Pokemon on the team, and it's something that this team needed. It's not like this team has bad speed tiers, but the fact that, you know, you have Raikou and Gengar and Persian all hitting that above 100 threshold, it's pretty nice. Raikou being able to Volt Switch around the team, Calm Mind if it needs to, it will end up being a win condition in some games, I'm pretty sure. And again, being able to provide a Volt Turn core with Raikou and any combination of Uxie, Serena, and Gligar. All of them can U-turn. Also, really quick before I forget, I need to mention that having Alolan Persian as a Z user is really great because of Z Parting Shot. He will be able to heal up some members of this team, and a lot of these Pokemon really appreciate that extra healing, such as Heatran and Manaphy, even Raikou, which can't necessarily heal themselves. I should also mention Gardevoir, I guess, because it does get Wish, but it doesn't really want to run it all the time. Being able to heal these Pokemon with basically your Z move is really, really nice, and basically can give the team a second wind and another chance at trying to win the game. You might think you have Manaphy pushed back into a corner and you've stopped the Tail Glow sweep, but he could easily just switch out Manaphy and bring it back to life later with Alolan Persian. This is one situation where I feel like having the two Z users split up like this works so perfectly. Yeah, the Z Crystal could have been really good on Raikou or Manaphy, for example, but these are still two really quality Z users. There's a good amount of hazard management on this team. Uxie is a very reliable Stealth Rock setter, so is Gligar, and then, even Heatran too. And there's a lot of good dedicated removal here. Serena is a really quality Rapid Spinner, and then Gligar is a great Defogger. They're basically built to fill those roles, and just as long as they're comfortable coming to the game, he should be able to remove hazards just fine. It's not like this team even needs removers that badly. This team really only has one Stealth Rock weak Pokemon, and that's Kyurem. Again, it's another situation where this team, yes, lacks a ton of hazard removers. It's not like every team can have the amount of hazard removers that Fadaki has. Luke's team manages to work because it doesn't necessarily need those hazard removers, but when he does need to remove them, he has two really good ones. They do share a bit of an ice weakness together, which I guess is one nitpick I could make. I also haven't mentioned Gengar at all really at this point, which I think is a really great pick, and it was a great late round pick. Having such a wide move pool and being such a fast offensive Pokemon really helps this team, especially when he was starting to add up all these Pokemon that are very defensive. Having an extra offensive Pokemon is really nice for this team, I feel. And just like how I mentioned with Stromfel's team, I feel like this team manages to fit a wide variety of playstyles and perform under a wide variety of situations. On the offensive end of the spectrum, you have your Raikou and you have your Gengar. Then you have kind of your bulky offense, but can also be hyper offense. You know, you have your Gardevoir, you have your Manaphy, which can Tail Glow, but it is still bulky and can run defensive sets at the end of the day. Kyurem, which is a very hard hitter, but also can be bulky. You can even say the same for Heatran. And then as you move, more down the defensive line, I can mention Gardevoir again, as it can be defensive in certain situations, especially specially defensive. Serena has reliable recovery, it can be the cleric for the team, and it can fill defensive roles, but it can also put out some nice damage as well. And then Uxie and Gligar are going to be your defensive end of the spectrum, and they are very good defensive Pokemon. I also completely forgot to mention Kamala, which is indeed another remover, but I'm not exactly convinced how many times Kamala is going to be brought. Kamala isn't exactly a stellar Pokemon. It's not like it's on the same level as Gumi in terms of being a meme pick, since it does have some usability, but I do think that Serena and Gligar kind of outshine Kamala. And so yeah, overall, I think this team is really great. If Luke manages to play really well under this team, I think he can get a lot of wins. And honestly, at the end of the day, that's true of every single team that I've talked about so far. Even though I had some criticisms for every single team, at the end of the day, it's Pokemon. And Pokemon is a game full of chances and odds. It's a game full of psychology and mind games. It's a game of information. It's a game of creativity. And basically, your team is what you will end up making of it. In this whole video, I've laid out essentially what I think of every single team and the potential that I see, but the people using these teams might see a completely different potential. They might see things that I've missed out on. I definitely don't want anybody to be discouraged if they got placed in this video lower than where they wanted to be. And on the flip side of that, I don't want anybody to be feeling comfortable because I placed them higher than they expected to be. Definitely don't get comfortable in a game like Pokemon, because especially in a draft league, which is a very competitive setting, people will be coming for your top spot. And essentially, I've put a target on the backs of the people that I've put up so high. It'll be up to them to use their teams, which I think are pretty good, to defend themselves. I wish everybody a lot of good luck this season, and I hope everybody this season has a lot of fun. I want to thank everybody that is participating this season. I want to shout out Bantix, that's how I've referred to him, or 2-Bit Crow. He's the one that runs the PEBA. He's a good friend and he helped me out with all these graphics. Great guy. I'm going to shout out, I mean I already have, but everybody that's playing and also everybody that applied. I know there are a lot of people that have applied to the PEBA, and I'm sorry that not all of you guys made it in. And I hope you do at least stick around because, like you've seen in this video, there are some really great teams here, and it's going to be even cooler seeing them in action. Talking about them is one thing, but I haven't really watched any games in preparation of this video. I got spoiled on the results of some games, but I still haven't really been able to actually watch them, so that will be fun for me to do. I do also want to mention, if you want to talk more about your team one-on-one, I am more than willing to help with that. Like I said, I may not be the greatest player alive, I may not be the greatest analyst alive, but I do want to be able to help grow this game, and I want to be able to help tutor people. And, you know, even if you consider yourself a good player, you can learn from talking to other people. And so if you would like to talk more about what could make your team better or changes you might make, I am always open to talk if you are a coach of the PEBA. I'm even going to put it out there to anybody watching this video. If you are in draft leagues and you need some advice on your team or your draft or whatever, I'm willing to help, especially if you think that my comments in this video sound insightful. Anyways, I'm hoping you guys learned something from watching this video. I hope I maybe shed some light on your team and talked about things that you might not have thought of yourself. And above all, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments. You guys can DM me on Discord. Please just don't yell at me for placing your team low or something. I mean, I do understand if you guys are a little upset about it, but again, don't take it too personally. These are just my opinions and my thoughts, and obviously somebody that has, you know, a bottom 3 team could end up winning the whole thing. That was my whole point in the beginning of this little outro here, is that your team is what you will make of it, and I believe everybody in here has potential to do well. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching so much. Shouts out to the PEBA or PEBA. That's pretty much what everybody calls it, is PEBA. But I tried to be official throughout this whole video and call it the PEBA. And I can't wait to see how the season unfolds. I'm rooting for all of you. Good luck. And I'll see you guys in the next video, whatever that is.